Excellent. All right, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We'll be starting in just a moment. Excellent. All right, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We'll be starting in just a moment.
Okay, so this is a panel of folks from the South, so I'm gonna need y'all to bring some energy this morning. Good morning, everyone. So super excited to be here with everyone and present on today's topic around resisting the new Jim Code in the South, offering lessons from the field. So I just want to quickly begin by offering some quick framing remarks. But before I do that, let me actually not be rude and introduce myself. My name is Clarence Oko. I use he, him pronouns. I'm Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Policy, working on our justice work. And I am also a member of the inaugural cohort of Just Tech Fellows at the Social Science Research Council. So super excited to be in conversation. Thank you. Super excited to be here and to be in conversation with y'all. So a little bit about today. So we all know that the proliferation of racialized algorithmic harms represents one of the leading threats to the civil and human rights of Black, brown, and indigenous communities. However, the expertise of our communities in resisting these forms of algorithmic oppression are constantly marginalized in legal policy, technical, and media discourse. This is especially true for Black communities and communities beyond the coast, particularly in the South. So as this conference explores all the different facets of the new Jim Code and other forms of technologically enabled harms, what we wanted to do was offer an opportunity to foreground the expertise of advocates, organizations, and movements that have been long committed to dismantling racial justice and social inequality. So we're excited to offer perspectives from three different communities that have been on the front lines of resisting racialized algorithmic harms impacting Black and brown communities in the South. Across three different domains, including youth justice, economic justice, and the fight to end police surveillance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Amalia to get us started with some other additional remarks.
All right. I struggle to take off my mask. Welcome to modern life. All right, and I'm going to stand because I'm a lawyer, and this is what we do when we talk. So I wanted to start by grounding everybody in the perspective that we bring as civil rights lawyers and advocates to this work. And so first is acknowledging that we are not technologists. And so when we use terms like algorithmic tools and AI and machine learning, we are not using those narrowly. We mean a fairly broad set of tools that are making decisions on behalf of employers, on behalf of housing providers and others, regardless of how sophisticated they are. But they are essentially processing information and recommending or giving a result to people. And I think the second thing is that we approach this from a very distinct sort of legal framework that helps guide our work, because it is how we actually try to bring some of these rights to life. And so, as many of you know, and as Chair Burrows talked about in the keynote, while there is no single overarching law that regulates AI or algorithmic tools in the United States, there are numerous civil rights laws which do apply right here today to these tools, and which we can and should use to ensure that they are actually giving fair results that create the kind of country that we want, rather than being used to reinforce longstanding systemic racism and other forms of bias. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which includes both Title VI, which regulates the actions of federally funded entities, and Title VII, which regulates employment, as well as the Fair Housing Act and other federal civil rights laws that we'll talk about during our presentation. These laws, while they were passed long before the creation of the tools we are talking about here today, apply with equal force to them in many instances. For example, the CFPB and DOJ recently filed a statement of interest in a case brought by the National Consumer Law Center against a tenant screening company. That tenant screening company was using in its algorithm a number of variables that have well understood disparate impacts on people of color, namely criminal legal contact, eviction history, and source of income. And the National Consumer Law Center sued on behalf of their clients, saying that that tenant screening algorithm was violating the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, and that therefore they were entitled to remedy. And the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, apologies for the acronyms, and the Department of Justice agreed and said, we are interested in this case. We think that this law applies to this tenant screening algorithm. And there are numerous other instances where thankfully the federal government is stepping up into this role that we want them to be taking and stating clearly that algorithmic harms are within the harms contemplated by existing civil rights laws. So I think the other bit of context I want to provide for everyone is what we mean when we talk about discrimination. And for those of you who were in Chair Burrow's keynote, this will sound familiar, but for those of you who missed it, discrimination comes in two main forms under civil rights law. There is discrimination where, for example, I as an employer say, I do not want to hire any Black people, any women, any people with disabilities, or people above a certain age. That's what we call disparate treatment discrimination, and it does happen in algorithmic tools. For example, at one point, Facebook was allowing advertisers to select audiences for its advertisements that were allowing advertisers to exclude groups of people that were protected classes under the civil rights laws. There is also another kind of discrimination which is equally important to giving life to the values that our civil rights laws uphold, called disparate impact discrimination. And I think that is what a lot of discussion has been happening about here at this conference, which is when there is a disproportionate effect on people of color or other protected classes because of the way a tool is actually making its assessments. And so when we're talking here today, we're going to be talking about both forms of discrimination, but primarily disparate impact, because that is where we're seeing more effects from algorithmic tools in the present day. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ava Tara.
I'm going to head up to the podium real quickly. Not because I want to be there, but that's how you play the videos. My name is Ava Tara Smith-Carrington. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a Strategic Initiatives Law and Policy Fellow at NAACP LDF. What I'm going to do is just play two quick videos because we were thinking of ways to really ground this conversation and a really concrete understanding of how race and technology interact, and how, if you're thinking about these things in a critical way, it's going to inform the way that we think about the use of surveillance technology or other forms of technology and hiring and the decisions that are made around education, even in the most simplest things in terms of, using the bathrooms here and hoping that soap comes out when you're like waving your hand underneath. So I'm gonna quickly play these two videos, and then let's see if this is gonna do what I want it to do.
With that, let me begin with a recent experience I had being a nosy sociologist, walking by two men in Newark International Airport, when I overheard one say to the other, "I just want someone I can push around." I didn't stick around to hear the end of the sentence, but I could imagine all types of endings. It could be in the context of looking through resumes, deciding who to hire. I just want someone to push around at work. Or in the context of dating or marriage, I just want someone I can push around in my personal life. The desire to exercise power over others is a dominant mode of power that has been given new license to assert itself. The kind of power that requires others to be subordinate, though we should remember this is not the only mode or theory of power. At the time, I was traveling to speak with students at Harvey Mudd College about issues of technology and power. And so when I overheard this conversation, I thought about this article and advertisement. from a 1957 Mechanics Illustrated. The robots are coming, and when they do, you'll command a host of push-button servants. And then it says, in 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. We'll all have personal slaves again. Don't be alarmed. We mean robot slaves. So much going on this one little paragraph. We could spend an hour, I'm sure, close reading and talking about it, but for the sake of time, I'll just point out two things. One is the date, 1957, a time when those who were pushed around in the domestic sphere, wives, domestic servants, and others, could no longer be counted on to dress you, comb your hair, and serve you meals in a jiffy, as the ad says. During World War II, many more white women entered the workforce to take up jobs formerly occupied by men who left to fight the war. And blacks, men and women, most of whom worked in agricultural and domestic work, also entered manufacturing workforce. Hence the desire to replace those sources of free and cheap labor in the home with push-button robots. The point is, no technology is preordained, but rather the broader context makes some inventions appear desirable and inevitable. Perhaps even more telling is that we will all have personal slaves again. That one little word tells us something about the targeted audience of the ad. Certainly not those who are the descendants of those who were enslaved the first time. The imagined user is gendered, raced, and classed without gender, race, or class ever being mentioned. Code words in this case encode interlocking systems of inequality as part of the design process. Precisely by ignoring social inequalities, tech designers will almost certainly reproduce it. True in 1957, true today.
There may be some people who take issue with the idea that machines can be racist without a human brain or malicious intent, but such a narrow definition of racism really misses a lot of what's going on. I want to read a quote that responds to that idea. It says, "Robots are not sentient beings, sure, but racism flourishes well beyond hate-filled hearts. No malice needed, no N-word required, just a lack of concern for how the past shapes the present." I'm going now to speak to the author of those words, Ruha Benjamin. She's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. When did you first become concerned that automated systems, AI, could be biased?
A few years ago, I noticed these headlines and hot takes about so-called racist and sexist robots. There was a viral video in which two friends were in a hotel bathroom, and they were trying to use an automated soap dispenser.
Black hand, nothing. Larry, go.
Soap is dispensed for the white hand.
Black hand, nothing.
And although these seem funny and they kind of get us to chuckle, the question is, are similar design processes impacting much more consequential technologies that we're not even aware of?
When the sort of early news controversies came along, maybe 10 years ago, people were surprised by the fact that they showed a racial bias. Why do you think people were surprised?
Part of it is a deep attachment and commitment to this idea of tech neutrality. People, I think because life is so complicated and our social world is so messy, really cling on to something that will save us and a way of making decisions that's not kind of drenched in the muck of all of human subjectivity, human prejudice and frailty.
We want it so much to be
We
true.
want it so much to be true, you know? And so the danger is that we don't question it. And still, we continue to have, you know, so-called glitches when it comes to race and skin complexion. And I don't think that they're glitches. It's a systemic issue in the truest sense of the word. It has to do with our computer systems and the process of design.
So, you know, I just want to say that these are the amazing words of sociologist and Professor Ruha Benjamin in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton, and author of several books, including Race After Technology and Captivating Technology. And the reasons why we wanted to show these two clips specifically was because in the process of thinking through what this conversation would be, We wanted to think of ways to show examples of how a history of racial subjugation in this country and the violence that comes with it influences and informs technological innovations, and specifically, in some conversations I will have surveillance technology. So as some of you might already be familiar with, Simone Brown in Dark Matters on the surveillance of Blackness talks about even some of the earliest forms of surveillance technology being lantern laws, and that, morphing into, modern day practice of stop and frisk. And then even some researchers have talked about even the way that we think about data. So for example, Caitlin Rosenthal, in thinking through scientific management, and investigating the meticulous records that were kept by enslavers, specifically measuring enslaved Black people, started to recognize how the data that was used in terms of the productivity of enslaved people helped enslavers understand how to get more productivity out of enslaved Black people. So these are just a couple of examples of how we're really, again, thinking about a history of racial subjugation is really informing and really going towards the ways in which technology is being used and how it's still coming today. So I'm gonna stop here.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Moss. I am a legal fellow at the Legal Defense Fund. And, as we all know, discrimination in technology and algorithmic discrimination comes in many contexts: in education, in housing, in policing. So we have decided to break our panel down into three kind of smaller sessions to really put a spotlight on a number of different ways in which some of the incredible advocates that we're joined by today are approaching the battle of civil rights in the technology space. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our panels very briefly, and then I'll kick it over so we have enough time to really hear from everybody. So our first discussion is called Digital Profiling and Youth Criminalization in Schools, and we are joined by Sarah Anderson, staff attorney at CARE Florida. Her work focuses on immigration and employment discrimination, and Clarence Oko, who you heard from earlier, will be in conversation with her, and he serves as senior policy at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. He works on the youth team, where he leads CLASP's cross-team work that aims to empower communities of color living with low incomes to challenge new and emerging threats from the criminal legal system. And I will turn it over to Clarence to get us started.
Thank you, David. Good morning, good morning, good morning again. We have the fun task of kicking us off and talking about Pasco. Oh, goodness. So I'll kick us off real quick by just kind of framing up what's been going on in Pasco for folks who are not familiar, and then we'll kick off our conversation. So about 2-3 years ago at this point, the Tampa Bay Times put out an investigative report revealing that there was a data sharing agreement between the Pasco County Sheriff's Office and the Pasco County School District. Pasco County is a community in Florida right outside of Tampa Bay. The data sharing agreement essentially gave law enforcement access to students' grades, their attendance records, behavioral histories. It also gave them access to histories of childhood abuse and other forms of really private information, the most intimate aspects of these young people's lives. Those data were then used by the sheriff's office to feed into a risk assessment model that essentially identify or score kids based off of 3 different levels of risk. So there are kids who were on track. Those were kids who they would not focus their attention on. But then there were 2 categories, at risk and off track. And those students in Pasco County, that was all the students in their middle schools and high schools. So that's a population of over 60,000 kids whose records would be accessible. Students who were selected, or students who had the highest scores were then selected and placed on what they call an at-risk youth database. And so this database essentially were about 400 or 500 kids who were subjected to enhanced surveillance tactics, enhanced law enforcement tactics, everything from going to having SROs and other police officers go into kids' homes, interrogating them in the middle of the school day to gather intelligence about their families, their friends, their social networks, subjecting them to the Baker Act, which is something that we can talk a lot more about. This is a law in Florida that allows for law enforcement to subject young people and people from all ages to involuntary psychiatric detention for up to 72 hours without notification to their parents. And we know that this program, based off the criteria that they were using, is going to have and is having a disparate impact on Black, brown, and indigenous young people, as well as young people who are young people with disabilities and young people attached to the foster care system. So, you know, it really is a powerful example of what this these new technological and digital harms can look like, how they intercede in long-standing historical crises that Black and brown communities are facing in the South. But yeah, we can dig into a little bit more, and I actually want to pick up on one of the themes that's been running throughout all of our discussions so far, which is historical context. So Sarah, I was hoping that maybe you could speak a little bit to what the history of Pasco County is and why it's so particularly alarming that they're interested in pursuing these type of policing strategies.
Thank you, Clarence. So Pasco County, as Clarence said, is just north of Hillsborough County. It is a county with a long history of racial discrimination. It is to this day a hotbed for Klan activity. It was one of the counties that resisted segregating or desegregating schools for a very long time. It is a county that at this point, along with a lot of other places in the United States, where in the schools, Black children are much more likely to be pulled in for talks with SROs, for discipline, for referrals, for whatever. So it creates, as Clarence said, this pipeline of these children are being targeted by SROs, targeted by their schools, which then that information gets referred to the sheriff's office, which then means that they are targeted in their homes, their families are targeted, their friends and acquaintances are targeted, and when the sheriff's office is able to gather information on both that child and their family and everyone around them, that then opens all of those people up to investigation by the sheriff's office.
And so, you know, one of the challenges so let me back up and explain. So both of our organizations are a part of the Pasco Coalition, People Against the Surveillance of Children and Over-Policing. We formed after these stories broke and wanted to develop a response to essentially end predictive policing, because this youth-focused program is one of at least 3 predictive policing programs that we're aware of in Pasco County in the last 10 years. The sheriff down there, Sheriff Nako, is quite the character. I like to call him Bull Connor with a smartwatch. There's not a technology that he does not want to embrace and incorporate into his policing. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what it has been like kind of navigating as a campaign, as a coalition, navigating, trying to achieve change when you're facing such a hostile environment, both amongst local policymakers, but also statewide in Florida, especially what's happening with the schools down there.
Yeah, it's very difficult. The schools and the sheriff's offices are not interested in any kind of reform at this point. The sheriff's office has stated that they believe that this program is very helpful, that it keeps the community safe. They've also stated in their documentation that they believe that the point of this program is to identify both adults and juveniles who are, quote, destined for a life of crime, and to try to deter them from that. Those deterrent methods are, of course, terrifying to the children, to their families. There are stories of children and families who are victims of this particular program who had officers showing up at their homes at all hours of the day and night, up to 18 officers at a time, banging on their windows, sitting outside of their houses for days on end, sometimes visiting multiple times a week for years. And a concerning part of this for a lot of the people on the list, especially for children and parents, is that there was no way to know if you or your child was on the list, and there was no way to get off of it. So people are experiencing this and they have no idea why, except if a Pasco County Sheriff's officer happens to tell you, listen, this is what's going on. And they would tell people who, there was one mother who they were targeting her son who had been put on their list. They took her and her minor daughter, dragged them out of their car for a quote-unquote seatbelt violation. They had both been wearing seatbelts at the time. Put her in the back of a car, and when she asked, why is this happening? Why am I being targeted? They said, well, your son's been placed on our list, and it is our directive to keep coming back, and we will keep coming back for years. And they openly told that to these people. And so it's extremely difficult. They are not open to any kind of oversight from people outside, and they're not open to change. And so it's made it very difficult. We're still, right now, Care Florida and the other organizations have been involved in trying to get the list from the sheriff's office of the people who are on this intelligence-led policing program list. And they have been fighting us for 2 years, almost 3 years at this point. We still don't have that documentation. They really do not want us to see it.
And I mean, I think that point is such a powerful one, right? Like the lack of transparency and the lack of political accountability. This is not a New York City. This is not a place where, this isn't a Chicago. I love Chicago. Shout out to Chicago. But this isn't like a place where even politicians have to gesture at being willing to hear us out. This is a place where they are outright hostile. And so parents can't even get basic information about whether or not their children are on this list. That is outright violation of FERPA and other kind of protections that exist at the federal, state, and local levels to ensure that folks can access the information about that's being used against them by schools. Like, they're supposed to have that right, and it's being systematically violated. What's also fascinating is, to Sarah's point, we have as a campaign engaged in multiple strategies, and we've had to. So we've done the grassroots organizing and activism. We've had parents and educators and other advocates going to school board meetings and trying to get this program shut down. We've had meetings with basically every official in Pasco County who has any kind of jurisdiction or authority on this issue, and we're constantly being turned away. The folks at CARE and LDF have had to resort to litigation to try and get the records that these families and that the communities are entitled to, just to know the demographic impact of this program. And then on top of that, now we're turning to federal advocacy, because what we discovered in the midst of all of this is that, surprise, surprise, the U.S. Department of Justice has supported each of the predictive policing programs that are being used in Pasco County. And so we have routinely been asking them, please stop allocating funding, using your discretionary funds to support these efforts. And I think it just really shows the level of coordination, the level of the types of multidisciplinary strategies that are necessary to resist these systems. But the challenge is, in Pasco County, this is a community in the South that has a really great community of advocates, but y'all are already fighting so many other fights. Are there things or insights that you want to share to this room that has technologists, other advocates around what organizations like CARE need to be able to kind of sustain these fights as these new technological harms continue to show up?
Yeah, so I think, as far as my perspective being at CARE, what we need the most is for people to be engaged and aware. If people are not aware that something is going on, and if they're not engaged with it, if they're not willing to join us at school board meetings, if they're not willing to help push this issue, then it doesn't get pushed. And to Clarence's point, it is such a widespread thing in Florida and in Pasco County. It's not just the school boards that's sharing information with the sheriff's office. It's the Florida Department of Children and Families. That's where they get information about kids who may be in broken homes, kids who may have been victims of abuse. They also have sharing agreements with local hospitals and with mental health facilities, so they can know when a child's been Baker Acted, when they've been involuntarily committed. So yeah, I would say just be aware of what's happening in your own communities, and look for ways to get engaged with the organizations that are already working to to make those things better.
Yeah, and I think, building off that point, it's a powerful example too, and it's a powerful reminder of the fact that these harms exist beyond the cities that we're used to kind of talking about and centering in these conversations. Every police department in this country is engaging in some shape, form, or fashion of this style of data-driven decision-making. Every school district is exploring the use of ed tech and other types of technologies, especially in the wake of a lot of these school shootings, wanting to find ways of militarizing and hardening their schools by using things like facial recognition and predictive policing, automated license plate readers, this kind of suite of technologies that are really subjecting young people to this kind of totalized version of state surveillance, that whether they're on social media, whether they're in school, whether they're at home, whether they're in the community, they are always, every aspect of their life is rendered visible to law enforcement and to political actors more broadly. And what does that mean? We had this conversation starting out with Bruja Benjamin, right, talking about this kind of long-standing historical context in which these technologies are stepping into. When you're talking about Black communities in the South in particular, right, the idea that you don't have the ability to tell the state when and where it can engage with you, the fact that you don't have the autonomy and the dignity to be able to say, no, this is too much, you've gone too far, that really is rolling back so much of the progress that we've achieved from the civil rights victories that Amalea started us off with, but even going back to Reconstruction, right? When you look at those Reconstruction amendments to the U.S. Constitution, they're about securing bodily autonomy, human dignity, equal protection under the law, these concepts that we really hold dear, but these technologies are being used in ways to totally usurp that. And from my opinion and from the work that we're doing in Pasco, that there's really no better place to fully understand and appreciate what those harms look like than by focusing on the impact on the most vulnerable young people in our society, Black, brown, indigenous young people with disabilities, young people who were systems attached, because those are the young people who have the most to offer us in terms of the story around what algorithmic harms look like. So as opposed to in kind of continuing to engage in top-down strategies, figuring out ways of telling stories from below and from beneath, listening to the expertise of advocates like folks at CARE Florida who are on the front lines of working on these issues, that's so essential to this work. I know that we're probably at time. We got a little bit more time? One more? Yeah, so any final thoughts to close us out? I know that we've kind of covered a lot of ground, and but just any kind of concluding remarks or insights you want to share with the group?
Yeah, so I think as far as closing remarks, insights that sort of I've taken away from this project, I was, and I think a lot of you are hearing about this, sort of shocked by the extent of it, shocked by the amount of information that the sheriff's office is able to obtain and the way that they use it. And so I think, again, it's just a matter of both being engaged with your community and also when thinking about the way that the algorithm that was set up to actually use this program is an algorithm that gives points based on certain different variables, such as we said, GPA, attendance, also if you're the victim of a crime, if you show up in someone else's police report, that can give you points on that. And if your parents have been divorced, exactly. If you're receiving any kind of care from the state, that can give you points towards being targeted. And what I was shocked by is the amount that this program specifically focused on children. Both looking at the data and reports from former officers who had been involved in this, they said that the focus of the sheriff's office was young people, disproportionately. And of the 20 most visited homes by these officers, more than half of them were the homes of children who were being targeted by this. And that concerns me the most, the fact that they are targeting young people and hoping to, in the words of one deputy, put them away so that once they're away, they don't commit crimes. So it's been a very eye-opening experience working on this, and as Clarence said, it happens all over the United States. This is just one of the ones that's more publicized. So keep your eyes open, be aware of what's happening in your communities.
Yeah, and our work as a coalition isn't done. We are launching a kind of statewide open records campaign because we want to understand what other communities have or incorporating policing technologies within their schools. And we're actually leading that campaign with an organization, a digital rights organization led by young people. I think that's where I want to leave off. Two quick, really important insights. One is young folks are a source of expertise in understanding how these systems work, and they should be a source of expertise in driving the solutions to these harms. And so figuring out ways of being able to incorporate young people, not only just in our campaigns and advocacy strategies, but also in thinking about how we're going to develop legal and policy protections that govern how these technologies are used. Incorporating those young voices into the design process is instrumental. But also being in proximity to communities, as we've been saying throughout this entire conversation, is really important, and building those relationships. Right now, we're working with a number of working with a number of communities around the country who are experiencing these harms around criminalizing technologies in school. We're calling it the Notice Coalition. No to criminalizing technologies in education. I did it backwards. Tech criminalization in education. There we go. To really begin to kind of support different communities around the country, places like the Twin Cities in Minnesota, communities in Texas, and elsewhere around the country who have been kind of confronting the use of these technologies to criminalize and otherwise harm marginalized young people. And we're trying to leverage the insights from the victories that we've been able to achieve in Pasco because, while we have had a really big struggle in terms of getting even the most minute change, we have been able to make some really critical milestones. The latest data sharing agreement between the sheriff's office and the school district prohibits the school-based police officers from having direct access to student records. The sheriff's office still has access through other means, but being able to kind of stop or at least minimize the actors who have access to student records is powerful. We've heard from some of the other litigation that's happening in the community that the sheriff is moving away from person-based predictive policing, which is great. But of course, because it's Bull Connor with a smartwatch, now he's trying to shift to geography-based or place-based predictive policing. But the fact that they have had to make those changes suggests that the work that we have been doing collectively across our organizations and coalitions has had an impact. And what we were talking about earlier is I can only imagine what more impact we could have if we had more support and engagement, especially from folks like the folks in this room who bring the technical expertise to help us understand and be able to translate the harms that are happening to these young people and their families to policymakers and others that have the ability to make change. So I want to maybe leave it there. And thank y'all again for having us and listening to our little vignette of a conversation.
Yeah, let's give it up for Sarah and Clarence. This is a great conversation. And for our next conversation, it is called Encoding Race and Structural Economic Disadvantage, and we are joined by Kat Welbeck, who is Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Council at the Student Borrower Protection Center, and she will be in conversation with Amalia Smirniotopoulos, who you heard from earlier, who serves as Senior Policy Counsel at LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, working on economic justice and criminal justice issues. And I will kick it over to Amalia first.
So thank you so much for joining us, Kat. I guess to start out, can you tell us a little bit more about what the Student Borrower Protection Center is?
Yes, certainly. Also, thank you so much for having me here. So excited to be a part of this conversation. So Student Borrower Protection Center, our name says a lot of what we do. We're a nonprofit advocacy organization solely focused on ending the student debt crisis. And we do that through several ways. So advocacy, so pushing for better policies to support student loan borrowers, elevating that in coalition, policymaking, advocating at both the federal and state level for better protections for student loan borrowers, and then also litigation. When student loan servicers or companies do bad things, we try to sue. So we do a mix of things in the student loan space, and many of you are probably like, so what does that have to do with this conversation? Understandably so. We're gonna get to that in a little bit, but part of what brought us into this space, many of us at the SBPC previously worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and so we'll kind of dive in a little bit of this conversation about how we got involved in this space, but yes, I'm a student debt advocate, but part of this conversation.
And so I guess to further ground the conversation, one, I was going to follow up on that. thread, how did SBPC get interested in algorithmic bias? And I also wonder if you could provide us a little bit of context about why student debt is an issue that really is a racial justice issue as well.
It's like my favorite question ever. Okay, so I'll start with the easier one and then I'll do the second one. So if you need to cut me off, Amalia, please do. So how do we get involved in the space? Again, many of us were previously at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. During those years at the Bureau, there was a lot of emphasis about increasing access to credit and thinking about ways, how can we provide consumers, particularly thin file consumers or consumers who just don't have very strong credit profiles, how can we increase their access to credit? Noble goal, wonderful, but it's really important about thinking about the pathways to increasing access to credit. Are you addressing, in a lot of these conversations, I think there's an undercurrent about the historical context. Are we addressing the systemic issues in our credit system that cause us to have, thin-filed consumers or consumers with subprime credit profiles? Are we addressing those systemic issues, or are we thinking about new ways to create another tiered credit market? And so a lot of the work at that time was thinking about, let's do regulatory sandboxes and think about these ways that these new fintech companies are using new alternative data to increase access to consumers. And so we were really interested in the ways that people, sorry, that is me. We were really interested in the ways that people were using education data. So school attended, the average SAT score, not yours, but of the school that you attended, whether or not your parents went to college, these type of factors in determining someone's credit worthiness. And so that was deeply concerning to us. So that's kind of how we got into this space. Why is student debt a civil rights crisis? Again, going back to historical context. Student debt is all about who has access to wealth in this country. If you come from a wealthy family, you don't have student debt because your family writes a check for you to go to school. They give you money to go to school. But when you come from a low-wealth household and you're told the only access to social mobility in this country is through higher education, what do? You take on debt to attend school. We have a deeply, deeply entrenched racial wealth gap in our country. So when we look at Black households, when we look at Latino households, we see that literally these households have about 1/10 of the wealth of white households. So who's more likely to take on student debt? Black and Latino students take on student debt at higher rates than their white peers. Particularly Black women have the highest student debt on average. And so not only do we see Black students more likely to borrow, but they borrow in higher amounts. So what happens to your wealth building opportunities over your lifetime? When you graduate from school, you have the student debt, you have student debt. You're more likely to experience wage discrimination. You're more likely to experience other forms of employment discrimination. And then it's so much harder to save for a home, save for retirement, if you want to start a small business. If you want to access credit, it's a lot harder when you have a very high debt-to-income ratio. And so we see over the lifetime that student debt cuts into people's ability to be able to build wealth. And so what happens when it's time for that person to say they want to have a family and they want to send their children to school, they might still have their own student debt. They're taking out student debt for their children because, the wealth building process over their lifetime was significantly shrunken by the student debt burden. And so that repeats itself. It's something that we're seeing now, the student debt crisis. We actually do see particularly a lot of, when we look at the crisis of parent plus borrowers, so these are parents who have their own, maybe their own student debt or taking out student debt for their children, and essentially that's even more of a crisis for Black borrowers. I can go on and on, but yeah, student debt is a civil rights crisis. If you have any other questions about that later, happy to talk about it all day.
Thank you, that was awesome. I think building on that, you started talking about your interest in alternative data at SBPC. And so why was the use of alternative data like SAT scores troubling to you?
I'm gonna keep going back to historical context and talking about the ways that oftentimes, people say like, well, it's the SAT score of a school, or if we look at people who went to these prestigious universities, that might tell us something about them and their ability to repay. Well, those are all, when Professor Benjamin was talking about these encoded biases, all these things, this data around us is deeply informed by the world we live in. We live in a country that has a deeply rooted and continued legacy of racism, and these systemic disparities carry through these various variables. So when we talk about SAT scores, that tells you a lot more about someone's, for like their parental income, their family their family's income versus their actual ability to have future earnings or success, right? It tells you a lot more about when we're talking about what school someone attended. Are we talking about segregation? Are we talking about the outsized importance that MSIs, minority-serving institutions, so our historically Black colleges and universities, our Hispanic-serving institutions, are we talking about the outsized effect that these universities have on those communities, particularly when we talk about many of these students historically have been denied access to some of these, and I'm gonna use the word prestigious with air quotes because, again, these are still value judgments. And when we talk about these value judgments, they're deeply, again, encoded in our nation's history of racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, all these things, right? They're so deeply encoded in all these other ways that our nation locks out people and their access and ability, like their access to social mobility.
And so when SBPC started looking into the uses of alternative data, what did you start finding?
Oh, certainly. So again, going back to our history at the CFPB, when we were there, this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was talking a little bit about regulatory sandboxes. The CFPB had this policy called, they had this no action letter. And so the idea, in short, is you can try out this new innovation that you have, and what we will say is if we engage in this no action letter with you, we won't sue you, we will still engage in supervisory activity, but we won't bring an enforcement action. To us, we're like, you can't do that, because there are potentially consumers being harmed in this process while you're trying to figure out if this product is viable. So that kind of drove us to kind of look at what are some of the ways that different lenders, different companies are using education data. So we just wanted to explore it. So we did a report. We looked at two companies. One example was, again, a product that no longer exists at Wells Fargo, but there was a private student loan product they had where there was different pricing, whether you went to a 4-year university or a 2-year university, going back to these encoded biases that's deeply problematic when we think like, let's charge community college students higher rates to go to college. That's just unconscionable. Then we also looked at another company, Upstart, a fintech lender that used education data among many other factors to determine people's creditworthiness. So we just did a little bit of mystery shopping. And so what we actually did, someone on our team used the same name, same zip code, same income. The only thing that changed was where they went to school. So did they put in a predominantly white university? Did they put in a historically Black college university at HBCU, or did they put in an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution? And what we found was that there was a disparate pricing based on, again, the price. Our colleague was given a much better pricing, looking at a PWI versus a predominantly white university versus an MSI, so an HBCU or an HSI. And so that's kind of how we got involved in this process. And then fortunately, we were able to connect with LDF, Clarence, hello, high five, and really delve into this process about looking more deeply into the company, their algorithm, and we could talk a little bit more about that process too.
Yes, and we're definitely going to touch on that too. I guess when you talk about a difference in pricing, how big was that difference?
That is a great question. I was like, I do not have the exact amount with me right now, but if anyone wants to follow up, I'll have that with me. But part of the point was just to add about the difference in pricing and why this is so significant, and going back to these encoded biases. Two things I'll say to that on the pricing, because I have lapsed on the actual difference. One thing that's really fascinating is that consumers don't know the pricing differential, right? So like, we were able to see that because, we kind of mystery shopped, got these different offers, but generally, one, this no longer exists on the website, so you can't do this. Two, a lot of other companies don't have the ability for you to be able to look at what your pricing would be if you were a different consumer, and most people don't think about that. When consumers are looking for credit, one, maybe they'll shop around and look at what is this company's rate versus that company's rate. I'm gonna say that's a very big may, right? If you actually even do that. But then two, most consumers aren't thinking, oh, well, this company might discriminate against me. I'm gonna see what pricing my peer is gonna get. And so there's also really this piece about a lot of people don't know when this happens to them. And part of it in doing this research, we looked at one company, but we're like, what does this say as an industry as a whole? And again, we'll talk some more about transparency, but I really appreciated something that Clarence and Sarah brought through is about this transparency piece, about the students not knowing they were on the list. In the same vein, you're like, I went to Howard, I went to a wonderful school, I'm credit worthy. All of these things, you may not think that your peer at, GW or Georgetown is going to get a better rate for you if you have everything else the same, but your school might be different because of these factors like the cohort data, not your individual data, but the cohort data about the SAT scores at the school that you went to, or just how that school might be tiered within a system. Sorry to answer the question, but
No, that was great. And we will have time for questions at the end, too. Yeah.
Yes, we'll take yours. Thank you.
Great. What? Last question. All right, it is all good. So I guess since we have only time for one more question, I'm going to give you the opportunity to give sort of key takeaways for folks from your work on Upstart.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I get so excited and I talk too long. Another just like shout out to Clarence and your amazing colleagues at LDF. Really helps really propel this work. So eventually we were able to engage in an independent monitorship with Upstart, a civil rights law firm, Relvin and Colfax, and so over the past 2 years have been looking at this model. Upstart's been making changes to this model. There were some changes from the initial reporting to now, but then also going through this process where we were looking through the company's algorithm. One thing I find fascinating about this is one company that worked with us, and I will say voluntarily engaged in this monitorship to literally open up, their model and look at it. That is one company, and it was voluntary. And coming from a regulatory background, I'm like, that's one company that wasn't even compelled to do this. So what does this mean for the rest of the market? What does it mean? One thing about this is a very time-intensive, a labor-intensive process, but like, how do we make sure that our financial regulators actually have the capacity to be able to do this market-wide? Because, we're talking about one company, again, voluntarily, but when we think about across the market, how do you make sure a regulated entity is compelling all the companies that it actually regulates to do this? How do you actually say we're doing supervisory activity if we're not actually able to fully understand the model? And so again, this is a very unique opportunity and we learned a lot from it, and I'm sorry it took so much time talking about other things, but I think that's the one really big takeaway. How do you replicate this and actually compel companies to do that? Because otherwise, are we actually really understanding the potential consumer harm?
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's give it up for Kat and Amalia, and please don't apologize. It's incredibly insightful. Thank you for that conversation. And so for our third conversation, we are going to do a spotlight on Atlanta, Georgia, which has been called the most surveilled city in America. And for this section, it's called Mass Criminalization, Surveillance Technology, and Race, The View from Atlanta. And we are joined by Devin Franklin, who is Movement Policy Counsel at the Southern Center for Human Rights. He joined SCHR in March of 2022 after working as a senior assistant public defender at the Office of the Circuit Public Defender, Atlanta Judicial Circuit, for over 12 years. And he will be in conversation with Ava Tara Smith-Carrington, who you heard from earlier as well, who's a fellow at the Legal Defense Fund. Prior to joining LDF, they were staff attorney at Lambda Legal, where they brought cases to advance civil rights for all TLGBTQ people. And I will turn it over to Ava Tara to get us started.
Great. Well, I'm really excited for this conversation. Seriously, I've been looking forward to this, Devin, so I'm glad that you are here. So for those who might not be familiar with Atlanta, can you share a bit about both the present and past landscape when it comes to policing and criminalization? Because again, I feel like this is the common theme right now of like, what is also, again, the historical context as we're going into this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. But before getting into that question, I just want to say and acknowledge like the awesome information that everyone else has shared. I'm on the panel, but I've kind of forgot that I'm on the panel. It was just like sitting here like a participant, just wowed by, in a bad way, by like the information. And it's certainly something that wants me to get activated. But yeah, Atlanta, what is it, past and present? I think Atlanta has a bit of a misnomer as a really progressive city. It's the home of Dr. King, and it is a city that historically has been kind of labeled the Black Mecca, a place where Black folks from around the country migrate to and find unparalleled success in terms of economics and financial opportunities and job opportunities and things of that nature. It had gained the nickname of the city too busy. The city too busy to hate, right? And I think there's kind of a play on that nickname that's more of a just description of it, and it is the city too busy moving to hate. It's a highly segregated city. And we really have black part of town and white parts of town and Hispanic parts of town, and there's not much intersection or overlap, right? And so with that in mind, policing in Atlanta has been an exercise in testing the boundaries of aggressiveness for some time. Going back to when Maynard Jackson was in office and he was the first black mayor of Atlanta and served several terms and got the airport building, whose the airport is named after, and these kind of things. During the height of the crack epidemic in the 80s, violence came with this particular drugs and transactions and things of that nature, and police departments across the country developed responses to that. Georgia's response, particularly Atlanta's response, was Red Dog, running every drug dealer out of Georgia. Okay, cute name, but it was a really vicious task force that focused on essentially using violence to attack drugs. It was just the paramilitary response to the war on crime, right? The war on drugs. That unit developed a really bad reputation. Skip forward a little while. The chief of police in Memphis, where Tyree Nichols was just murdered by police, she was former Red Dog in Atlanta. So the tactics that were used in Memphis were learned in Atlanta and kind of extrapolated not only to Memphis, but I'm sure other places around the country. This unit was so bad that in 2008, they were involved in the murder of a 92-year-old woman who they had alleged was engaged in drug sales, and they had got used a no-knock warrant to bust into her house, and they fired 30-something shots and created a narrative that she shot at them. Come to find out, she fired one bullet. They fired like 37. Her bullet did not hit any of them, and they lied about the circumstances of that, but they also went about like planting drugs and later admitting to the fact that they planted drugs to try to justify the nature of the warrant, right? So when that became unpopular, they got rid of it, and most people would clap their hands and say, "Yay, Atlanta's learning." No. They replaced that unit with something called the APEX unit. We love acronyms. It was like Atlanta's proactive enforcement and interdiction unit. That does not spell apex, but nevertheless, that's what they call it. And like the calling card for this was a aggressive response to, again, drug trafficking in neighborhoods and communities, right? And that lasted for about 10 years, and COVID happened, and they got rid of that, and they have a new unit called Titan. And so I would say that Atlanta, as a native Atlantan, I would say is probably a more directly oppositional, aggressive, in-your-face kind of policing that, of course, has racial disparities that come along with that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like as you're talking about this, as I'm hearing it, especially in talking about the segregation that's in the city, one thing that keeps on coming to mind, and something that we talked about in preparation for this conversation, was a little bit about the creation of encounters. Like, how are encounters created in order to pretty much bring in law enforcement into communities? And so, in many instances, surveillance technology can be deployed in communities to not only surveil and collect information, but also create these encounters. And some of these things that we talk about, folks have possibly heard of. So one example is ShotSpotter, and then I know that we were talking about low-level misdemeanors. And so again, kind of going into the weeds a little bit, how in creating these encounters, like, how does it impact the community, and what does it actually look like in real life, day-to-day, for folks in Atlanta?
For people in Atlanta, well, it's kind of two questions there, right? So the first one is that I'm not sure how many people are really knowledgeable of what ShotSpotter is. Does anyone, if I just say it, do you know what it is? For those of you who don't know, it's essentially technology that it's like a big tower that's placed somewhere in the city, and it is supposed to be able to detect gunshots, right? And then not when a phone call comes in or someone says, "I saw someone shoot someone," or "I saw someone fire a weapon," but when this machine says, "Oh, there's a gunshot in the area of Peachtree Street at this corner," officers are dispatched to this area. what we have come to learn is that it is not really accurate. Car backfires, fireworks, what other random short, sharp sounds can sometimes activate this kind of thing, right? And so it very often draws police to areas that are majority black. Atlanta is a city that at one point in time was majority black. I think we are like at 49% as of like last year. This is a city that in the mid-90s was like 64% black. We can talk about gentrification later on. But technology is being used as a justification for police occupation of predominantly black communities. I would probably offer that as for Hispanic communities as well. But in Atlanta proper, we don't have large neighborhoods of Hispanic communities, right? In our suburbs, we certainly do. But what that brings us to when we talk about just like the rate of arrest for how does this actually impact communities? There's this conversation, I think it exists everywhere, but particularly in Atlanta, that, oh my God, crime is off the chain, so we have to have more police officers. And crime is off the chain because we don't have enough. And I'm doing work on a project, a use of force project, where we are, we are able to access certain data, and we were able to learn, like, Atlanta is like a really well-funded police department, right? It's better funded per capita than 71% of police departments in the country. It has more police officers than like 89% of departments in the country. And when we talk about how they use these resources, we see that they effectuate the arrest of people, all colors, for low-level offenses, so thinking misdemeanors, low-level felonies like theft or breaking into a car or something like that, more than 85% of other cities in the country. And of those arrests, more than 90% of the people arrested for these types of offenses are black. So what we see is that the police occupation of these communities tends to lead to more, I'm gonna use the word frivolous, arrests. And we can also just get into like the long stages of detention that people experience pre-trial, before getting a right to a trial, before getting indicted, before getting to a position where they can actually exercise, meaningfully exercise constitutional rights in defense of themselves.
So kind of moving into what you're talking about Atlanta's police force being well-funded, another thing that has come up, which is that Atlanta's a city of cameras, essentially. So, and some of the research leading up to this conversation, one thing that, I came across was that in a February 2021 report, essentially, researchers found that while Chicago, which is interesting because we're in Chicago, has the most cameras, Atlanta is the most surveilled with 48.93 cameras per 1,000 people. So I wanted to hear if you could share a little bit about how the proliferation of surveillance technology is shaping and impacting Black people, and specifically the role that the Atlanta Police Foundation has in Atlanta being a heavily surveilled city.
Okay. So I'm going to break this down as quickly and succinctly as I can. There's the Atlanta Police Department, which is the municipal funded police agency. There is a private nonprofit agency known as the Atlanta Police Foundation that provides additional funding and other aid to the Atlanta Police Department, which is a wild thing in and of itself, because I want to say like last year the police department budget was like 60-something% of the entire city budget. So to the extent that they're already super well funded, and they've gone over that funding, I learned at a meeting yesterday, they also have this other arm of support that is not subject to the same open records type responses as a city government is, right? And so one of the things they have is this situation called Operation Shield, where it's just kind of a system of cameras that are placed around the city, and you essentially just have cameras everywhere. We have private entities, Midtown Blue is one, which is sponsored by commercial retailers in Midtown Atlanta, where they come together and pool money to kind of have their own private police department, and they are just forever surveilling, right? there is a push for citizens to give access to their Ring doorbell cameras, or I'm not sure what the other companies are, the same people that do what Ring do, right? To give access to your personal cameras to be part of the system that is consistently monitored by someone at the police department. But these are actions that are kind of pushed forward by the Police Foundation, and so it's kind of this cloak of, like a sinister cloak of secrecy, where these initiatives are pushed forward. But there's this distance that the police department is able to kind of keep their hands off of, and it allows for the same initiatives that are benefiting the police department to go forward, but without the same level of public scrutiny.
So, Devin, before joining the Southern Center for Human Rights, you were a public defender for 12 years. What are your thoughts on APF, so again, the Atlanta Police Foundation, and you're gonna hear that name a lot. What are your thoughts on APF's Repeat Offender Commission, which is essentially an entity that shares real-time awareness of a convicted person's interactions with the criminal legal system and how that information is then used?
So, in Atlanta, and I'll offer this for like just the world in general, I think we kind of have, as a society, this dichotomy of good people and bad people. Not intentionally, not all of us are like trying to just say like, that's a bad person, I don't want anything to do with them. But I do think that almost as a survival instinct, people have operated in this fashion for a long time. And that has kind of been incorporated into a system into the legal system in Atlanta in a way that allows for expectations for good people when they interact with the legal system, but justifications for how poorly, quote unquote, bad people are treated. So when we get to this concept of the Repeat Offender Commission, which is essentially like a joint task force between the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, so Fonnie Willis, the woman that is currently prosecuting Young Thug and Donald Trump at the same time, and years ago was responsible for the RICO indictment of public school teachers. She does a lot. That office, the city government, as well as the police department, have created this narrative that crime in Atlanta is bad because this number of people, these 800 people, are responsible for 80% of the crime. And they'll publish, like, this person who was just arrested has been, had 60 cycles within the government, within the judicial system. And it kind of, again, paints this narrative that creates this umbrella of permissibility for how people are treated. And it's like, well, it's okay to treat that person that way because they're a bad person. But at the same time, I don't think people realize that, you are allowing Atlanta to kind of become this laboratory and its citizens to essentially become guinea pigs for testing out these various systems of oppression and surveillance. And so I think the Repeat Offender Commission is kind of more of a narrative effort that is supported by kind of this really archaic form of technological and data analysis that is designed to separate citizens and look at people a different way.
So on the topic of RICO, but also on the topic of, Atlanta becoming like a laboratory of sorts to test out things, I'm sure that some folks in the room might want to hear some of your thoughts on Cop City, and specifically what's happening in Atlanta. And just to check, are folks aware of what's happening in Cop City? Okay, I'm seeing like a couple of hands and some head nods, but we'll have you explain, Devin, just in case. And if you can you also then expand on the role that surveillance technology is currently playing in suppressing dissent against Cop City as well?
So, Cop City in 2 minutes. In 2020, across the country, there were a series of uprisings related to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, right? And in Atlanta, I don't know if folks, I know it was broadcast in Atlanta because we were there, but we had our uprisings, and our local rappers came on TV and chastised the citizens about, engaging in protest. And shout out to Killer Mike and T.I. But no, so at that point in time, like, police morale reported became really, really low. Speaking of APF as well, they went on what we call the blue flu because an officer who had shot and killed Rayshard Brooks was fired temporarily. A lot of officers did not like that. They called sick out of work, and APF later kind of gave them bonuses to replace the income that they lost during that situation. But also, as a response to this drop in morale, the messaging, again, this element of narrative comes into play, where in order to make officers feel better and to better train them and to make them not kill people at the rate that they were killing people, they needed better training. And so there came this idea of a public safety training center where police, EMS, firefighters would share a campus, and they were going to, City of Atlanta bought land in DeKalb County, so it's not City of Atlanta proper. It's just land they own in another place, like right next to Atlanta. And they decided to convert 380 acres of forest. They've at least cut down about 80 acres at this point in time to develop a campus that is to include a mock city. And in the illustrations and graphics that we've seen, it includes like a mock school, a gas station, a hotel, some houses, a nightclub, a whole little city for police to practice paramilitary tactics. They will say that this is not for paramilitary tactics, but visuals we've seen at the presentation, you can look it up online and see it. It's what it is. Officers in these kind of aggressive units like Red Dog, like Apex, like Titan, learning how to maneuver and handle situations within the city. So there's been a lot. It's kind of a really unique movement because you have social justice advocates, people who were activated by the uprisings of 2020, but you also have environmental activists who, really care about the environment. And there's this intersection and this unity that has created this kind of multi-racial, multi-coalitional group. And, people have been protesting this situation for over 2 years at this point. The project's supposed to cost $90 million. It was allegedly $30 million coming from the city. $60 million was supposed to come from the Atlanta Police Foundation, the private entity we've been talking about. News broke a few weeks ago that, the city's actually paying $67 million. The police foundation is only paying like $20, and it's just a mess, right? In response to it, people have engaged in actions for a while. And beginning last year, we began to see a pattern of mass arrests in response to people protesting we call it Cop City. Those people were able to be bailed out by an organization called the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. And what the Atlanta Solidarity Fund does, they bail people out, but also after you are charged, and where we come in, is that you are connected to an attorney, free to you, and that we are able to provide funds for. So that person's not doing pro bono work because it's really hard to defend these kinds of cases for free because they take months and months on end. Well, I was on vacation trying to enjoy my time a week or two ago, and while I'm in line at the Animal Kingdom in Florida, I get a text that the Atlanta Solidarity Fund house, they call it the Tear Down House, was being raided by a SWAT unit. And if you look up the video, it's 10 officers with like the police military type tank with their SWAT suits on and the AR-15s. And they're, going into a house. And this is like, if you were to wake up in the morning at 8 o'clock and go to work, you would not be able to drive down your street because they blocked off the street to arrest these people and charge them for charity fraud for purchasing COVID tests and signs, stuff to make signs for protests. They said it was a misuse of the funds. I'm not overly familiar with the charges, but this is what the warrant says. We get into the surveillance aspect of this, though, because there's a public Twitter account called Defend the Forest. And, a lot of actions are called, like, it informs people when protests are being done. It sometimes has, some aggressive language. But because I guess there was supposed to be this link between Solve Fund and Defend the Forest, they wanted to quell movement. Like, I will also add that public sentiment around this is really one-sided. 2 years ago, during the pandemic, there was public comment at City Council, but it was virtual, and it was like 14 hours of public comment by citizens, and it was like 70% against it. And you know, when the funding vote came up a few weeks ago, we're in person. We had over 17 hours of public comment from Atlanta citizens saying, no, we don't want this, right? So I was to say, public sentiment is not really in favor of this project. And I think there's an urgency from the Police Foundation, the City Council, which is majority Black and majority Democrat, the state government led by Governor Brian Kemp, which is like, you know, a stark Republican, to say the least. And we generally celebrate bipartisanship, but bipartisanship is really harmful and dangerous right now. And they all are wanting to quell this movement. And so I think the surveillance of these Twitter accounts, we have submitted ORAs. I'm kind of new to the organization, but people I work with, we have seen documents that show that my coworkers are being monitored by government agencies to see what they're saying about the movement. But I think there's just this effort to use surveillance and develop these arrests to stop people from protesting, to allow them to kind of get this deal done and completed in the dark and against the will of the people.
All right, Devin, I want to thank you so much for your time up here. Y'all, please give it up for Devin. This is really important.
Thank you so much, Devin and Avatara. So we would like to open it up to questions. Anybody has any? Yes.
Is this one? Yeah, okay. Hi, Christina Harrington. I'm currently an assistant professor at the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon and helping to organize FACT this year. I just want to thank y'all for being here and a lot of this information. So I'm on the tech and design side of things. And there was a session, I believe yesterday or the day before, where people were talking about the theories of ethics in AI and in tech. And I oftentimes struggle with that because I'm hearing what you're saying about Atlanta. Atlanta has a very special place in my heart. I did grad school there. I've been in and out of Atlanta since 2013. Atlanta's always been home. My family is there. And when I hear things and I'm like, okay, there is theories of ethics of how do we govern what essentially the tech sector has created, or how do we just dismantle? Because the reality is, once these things are out there, you cannot overlay like a nail polish a set of ethics on these technologies that are inherently disastrous in a lot of senses. So from you all's perspective, where do you see the tech sector and a lot of the folks in this room, I don't know how many people in this room are CS, computer science or design or where do we play a part? How do we kind of bridge with some of the policy folks that are seeing firsthand the implications of the technologies that are being created, particularly when we're talking about surveillance, particularly when we're talking about harmful algorithms. I know that we've started to see tech companies hiring policy folks to be in-house to say, how do we do a checks and balances type thing? But what does that forecast honestly look like? Especially in this moment when, we have folks that are firsthand saying, we don't recognize what we've created in terms of AI, we might be seeing a problem.
It's an excellent question. Building the bridge, do we have, yes? Sorry.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm going first. So two things. One, I think that if you are at least at a point of recognition of I have this skill set that could do harm, I think it is incumbent upon you to, try to influence those who you work along with and others who you come in contact with, because folks like us can organize and develop strategy around how to stop a particular thing. But, I think the evolution of technology and surveillance technology particularly moves so fast, and litigation inherently moves very slow. So until we can get to a point where the ball has kind of stopped, like you said, we can't unring the bell. What's been done has been done. But if we can get to a point where we can know what we're fighting and only fight this, and the progress from surveillance is just like incremental, and we're able to kind of have more of our agencies working coalition with one another to identify and attack those things. That's one thing. The other thing is, and I think you kind of alluded to this, having policy folks in the techno field. Also in our policy area, we like maybe should have CS and design folks in our field, because as a PD, right, like I had to become an expert on things for trials, one thing at a time, but I can't fake the knowledge that you all have developed over a course of years of study and practice and expertise, right? So I think making sure that your expertise is available to folks like us, you know, having that lane of communication, that avenue is super important as well.
I'll go really quickly and just say, like, this is actually a conversation that I felt like was coming up last night over dinner in terms of, you know, I've been here since Monday and I've heard so many really great conversations happening, and some of them have been ones that have like made my brain spin out because of people talking about like what does it look like to actually hold ourselves accountable or to try to perfect these systems that we know are broken. And part of me is thinking, don't perfect it. Like, this system is actually not broken, it's functioning exactly how it should be because we are in a fundamentally broken system. So anything more is just gonna keep on causing damage. And so that's why I think it's critically important to actually engage in these conversations right here and right now, because if we're actually engaging in this discussion, that means that at some point while you're doing this work, you're gonna recognize like, oh, there was a discussion on this, and I think that this tool is gonna cause this issue. So let me actually get on the phone right now and figure out how we actually start talking about how to either undo what it could cause or start thinking about the guardrails that we need to have in place if it's already running. And I think that that's critically important because, again, as folks have been saying, technology is like speeding forward. And unfortunately, I don't see some of our places and spaces catching up. We're doing a lot of work that is very reflective of how we have done this work in the past when we've thought about civil rights in physical spaces, but not in digital spaces and not with the advent of technology and especially surveillance technology.
I will co-sign everything that Avatara and Devin said. You know, I think from the economic justice perspective, there are also places where people are making what might be well-intentioned efforts to try to correct for systemic issues, like credit scoring. It has vast disparities against people of color. And there might be opportunities to expand what we include in credit scores and include different kinds of data that more accurately assess whether someone's actually able to pay. But then we run into these issues where people are bringing in sources of information that actually have nothing to do with actual ability to pay and that contain the same systemic racism that our existing systems have. So I think being cautious, even if your efforts are coming from a good place, is really important. And I would also say, you know, we are now engaged in these national level discussions and international discussions about the uses of technology. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is, unlike the EU, which has come up very clearly and said discrimination is the threat from AI, I'm worried that the federal government could get distracted by the other shiny objects in this field. And I think, you know, to the extent that the academic community, in addition to the civil rights community, could be elevating the importance of centering civil rights as we are looking to regulate at the executive and legislative level, these technologies would be critical, and helping people understand, you know, what these systems are and how they work, and that they are only a black box because we are letting them be.
Well, this makes it harder because y'all just said all the great things. So just really quickly, one, I absolutely love this question because it's something that I think just kind of tying back to one of the things that I was saying about transparency is one of our biggest things that in doing this work is because again, coming from previously being at a regulator and again, having a very unique opportunity where one company, again, opened up their model to us. And again, it's just very scary to think, to your point, is like, if we cannot see what every single company is doing, there's no way to correct for it. And so like, again, back to your question, it's really hard for me because I'm like, will we ever, like, does the federal government have the capacity to do this? One, like, how do we actually make that a reality? In a world where literally the CFPB is fighting to exist, like, what do we do? And again, I might be losing sight of your question, but I think one of the biggest things too is just be continuing to, like, one, like you said, yes, pushing internally, like having a policy team to do this, but like actually having meaningful engagement with regulators and saying we should do this. We should actually open this up, because I think there's, again, going back to fairness, it's kind of like, what's hard for me is like, I guess, yes, working for a company, maybe you're like, our job is to like, make sure that we're just not violating the law, right? But I'm like, that is the floor. There is so much more that you can be doing. We're like, well, we're not illegally discriminating, right? Like, we might be, you know, there might be some disparities here, but like, we're not breaking the law. It's like really pushing ourselves to say, like, should that be the bare minimum of what we do? Like, what is our definition of fairness? And so I just really like that question, because like, I think that's one for y'all to push, because I think it's hard for the government to come in, and again, to Devin's point about having that level of expertise. And Clarence, I was literally seeing my eyes in meetings as we're talking about like the model. I'm like, oh, I don't know what you're saying, right? And so like, you all have like this very unique perspective where you have the expertise and hopefully the will to push, but that would be the only thing I'd add.
Yeah, everyone said so much great stuff so far. But I will again reiterate that point about the expertise. You know, sitting up here as an attorney, I don't have the level of insight that you developers, computer science people would have about these things. And so I think just as in the legal profession, where it is incumbent upon you to act in a way that is just and influence people around you to act in that same way, I think it's also very important in this emerging field for the people who are developing it to be very aware that it is a human-created object or program that is going to come complete with conscious or unconscious biases built into it, and make your best efforts to address those things before they become a problem.
What more can be said? So a couple of just quick thoughts. One around ethics. Personal belief, AI ethics is a distraction, right? And I know that that's been the dominant like frame for how so many of us have been thinking about this issue, but it is a distraction. If you walk away from anything else from these conversations, what you're hearing, this is a discourse about power, right? And this is about who wields the power to shape how the future is going to be designed. And that's a long-standing conversation. When you think about, at least in each of these domains that we've spoken about, in civil rights in particular, go back to the 1960s, right? When folks were marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, nobody was marching because we wanted an ethical version of Jim Crow, or how can we dispense these laws in a more ethical way. It's nonsensical. And so like when we hear this, we're like, what are you talking about? We need to have fundamental rights and obligations that are imposed on these companies and on these public actors as well, because that's another theme that runs through our work, to prevent them on the front end. And the civil rights community has the expertise. We've done this before. Look at the Voting Rights Act, right? If you look at the proliferation of voting discrimination in the South prior to the enactment of the VRA, and you look particularly at the power of preclearance, right, and the ability to essentially eradicate that type of discrimination, systemic discrimination. That's a concept that we can bring into governance in this space. But I think the fundamental thing that we all have to kind of walk away with from this conversation is we have to be in community and in relationship with one another. I know, you know, CS folks, y'all are brilliant, y'all get clicking, clacking away and want to kind of work in your silos, but like we really need you. We need to know I can pick up the phone and call this person for the technical expertise. I can pick up my phone and call this person to say, hey, can you help translate this for a community group? Or, hey, this is happening, right? And we need someone who can kind of help us build out our movements, to see yourselves as part of our movements. That's so essential. And the final thing that I'll say is this. There's so much power, right, that you all have collectively to organize amongst yourselves. I look at movements like No Tech for ICE and how technologists came together and said, we're just not going to give this information, give these skills, give these resources over to harmful actors. Where is the No Tech for cops, right? Where is the No Tech for criminalization? Where's the no? We can begin to imagine building out different models for how you all can leverage the power that you have to shape how you are organizing yourselves and how we're having this public discourse, right? That every time Sam Altman gets up and talks about, oh, well, this is an existential threat to humanity, bring that conversation back to us, right? Because at the end of the day, I think about the work of Afro-pessimists who talk about how black folks have survived the end of the world over and over and over again. These technologies are ending our worlds every single day. And so we need you all to kind of take that microphone and point it in the direction of all the folks up here and this broader constellation of racial justice and civil rights organizations that have been for over 100 years now on the front lines of fighting to save our worlds and to save our lives.
Thank you so much. I apologize. I wish we had time for more questions, but we are at time. That was an incredible question to end on and such great answers. And let's give it up one more time for our incredible panelists today. But please do feel free to catch us. We'll be around. So happy to talk to you later.